years. But underneath the timidity and the moderation of the leadership of the Irish Labour Party and the Irish trade union movement, there is, at the time of the Irish Revolution, a strong course of militancy amongst Irish trade unionists. And I'm not only talking about urban trade unionists. Did you know, for example, that there was a similar strike lockout to Dublin in 1913 in, of all places, Wexford? Now, you would hardly regard Wexford as a bastion of working class struggle, but the same thing happened in Wexford. In the final years of the First World War, I was talking about how it was not the best time to go and strike in 1913, where there was surplus labour scrabbling around for a limited number of jobs. Towards the end of the war, when food was in demand to feed the United Kingdom because of the German blockade, Irish tillage was particularly sought after, and agricultural workers knew this. There were fewer of them. Many had joined the army, and they struck for higher wages, and then and got them. And then after the First World War, they struck for the abolition of the reduction of wages, which was being threatened in the post-war recession, with a certain degree of success. Throughout the whole of the early 1920s, there was a constant degree of militancy amongst Irish workers, both rural and urban. There was a major post office strike in Dublin, in fact throughout the whole of Ireland, in 1923, which was only defeated by the Free State Army with fixed bayonets. And let me read you, I came across this in a book I read recently by Ryle Dwyer and Michael Collins of the Civil War, and I thought, well, you wouldn't think this would happen where it happens. Let me read. We're talking about 1922. Collins appealed for unity and decried the growing unrest throughout the country. He complained in particular about communist activities. In recent weeks, there have been reports that workers at 7 Cleve factories, that's the name of the company, which specialised in dairy products in counties Cork, Tipperary and Limerick, had attempted to establish Soviet rule. The red flag was hoisted over the factory in Clonmel. The following day, Collins referred to Soviet activities after workers from the Clonmel factory picketed shops that did not stock Cleve's butter. The men and women picketers refused to move for the Republican police, and the IRA, even after the troops threatened to open fire if the street was not cleared. The picketers held their ground, and the IRA withdrew. Now, you don't read about that in the history books, and that's my frustration about looking at the lockout is just a precursor to the nationalist revolution, because we all know that there are major political philosophies in Irish politics. We're familiar with the constitutional nationalists of the Home Rulers, everybody from John Redmond right up to John Hume in our present day, the people who believe in, Irish self-determination through peaceful parliamentary means. We're all familiar with the militant Republicans, whether it's Patrick Pearse or Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness in our own day. We're all familiar with Ulster Unionism, whether it's Edward Carson or Ian Paisley. We're all familiar with that. But how many of us are familiar with this fourth strain in Irish politics? The not minuscule, let me put it that way, the not minuscule tradition of the labour and trade union movement in 20th century Ireland, which, I would argue, because it hid its light under a bushel from 1918 to 1923 and subsequently, basically has never come into its own. It's certainly in the politics of the independent Irish state, and that's even without going anywhere near what happened in Northern Ireland. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with De Valera in 1926 saying that, to all intents and purposes, Fianna Fáil is the Irish Labour Party. And he was roundly rebuked, not least of course by the Irish Labour Party for saying that. But there's an element of truth in it. In the same way as the British Labour Party replaced the British Liberal Party, you could argue, with a certain degree of accuracy, that in independent Ireland, certainly up until the last election in 2011, it was Fianna Fáil because of its heady, potent combination of populism, reform, radical reform, nationalism, and of course religiosity that attracted the support of people who ordinarily, particularly in rural areas, would be expected to support a Labour Party. And it's a statistical fact that even to this day, or certainly up until, because everything changed of course in the general election in 2011, certainly for the history of the Irish state from independence in 1922 right up until very, very recently, most Irish trade unionists supported Fianna Fáil, not the Irish Labour Party. Can I just finish by reading from John A. Murphy, former professor of history in University College Cork, his magisterial account of the status of the Labour Party in independent Ireland. Before I do that, I have to say that both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were adept in the 20s and 30s of employing the Red Scare, to even further undermine the possibility that Irish Labour would come into its own. And in a very, very Catholic country, in the 30s in particular, that was a very, very potent force. Labour was still, up until the 1960s in Ireland, riven by personal animosity and personal disputes between its leaders. Larkin makes an appearance back in 1923, tries to recover the leadership of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. People like William O'Brien, of course, are having none of it. They stuck it out through thick and thin. They don't want this, Arab East coming back and attempting to take over their trade union. Larkin, in a fit of pique, establishes his own Workers' Union of Ireland, and then the two trade unions and the Congress of Irish Trade Unions remain split between Larkin and O'Brien right up until the 1940s. And in the 1940s, William O'Brien actually leads the Irish Transport and General Workers Union out of affiliation to the Labour Party, establishes his own National Labour Party. So in the late 1940s, you have two Labour parties, each with 5 TDs each. What a ridiculous state of affairs. And the various wings of the Irish trade union movement never came back together under the Congress of Irish Trade Unions until as late as 1959. I'll just finish, if you let me read this, what I thought was a very, very good account of why the Labour Party in Ireland, despite the promise, despite the revolutionary potential of 1913, has achieved so little in the years since. He says, numerous factors account for the weakness of the Labour Party in the years after independence. A weakness at first sight surprising in a society of poverty, unemployment and bad housing conditions. It is arguable that it never really recovered from its decision not to contest the 1918 general election. At a time when the franchise was greatly extended and the whole new generation was being politicised, the electorate was deprived of the opportunity of forming a Labour voting habit. Though the party performed a valuable service to parliamentary democracy by constituting the opposition in the Dáil before Fianna Fáil's entry in 1926, the polarisation of Irish politics around the treaty and the prevailing obsession with constitutional issues continue to relegate Labour to the background. Other adverse factors were the lack of support from a rural society largely composed of conservative small farmer owners, the draining off by emigration of social discontent and therefore potential support for Labour, the absence both of an industrial proletariat, given that Northern Ireland contained most of it. It gives the figure that as late as 1926 there were as many domestic servants as there were factory workers in the Irish Free State, and of a numerically significant agricultural labouring class, and the gulf between the northern and southern working classes sealed by partition. Labour's appeal was narrowly and basically manual working class, and not until the 1960s did it even try to attract a wider social support or appeal to intellectuals. And that's not even going into the 1960s and later on to the days of England Gilbert and the involvement of the Irish Labour Party in the current coalition. So maybe, after all, De Valera was right. The Labour Party in Ireland is Fianna Fáil, or was Fianna Fáil.